Hey guys, tonight we begin with a mystery buried beneath hot desert winds, broken statues, and silent stone walls. Not a story about pyramids, not a story about gold, and not even a story about a king whose armies shook the world. Tonight we begin with a question. Because history is full of people who became famous, but sometimes the most fascinating people are the ones who almost disappeared. Ancient Egypt was built on permanence. Pharaohs carved their victories into stone because stone survives longer than memory. Temples rose beside the Nile like mountains created by human hands. Names were carved into walls because to ancient Egyptians, being remembered meant continuing to exist even after death. To erase a name was not just political punishment. It was a second death. It was the destruction of identity itself. And that is what makes tonight's story so strange. Imagine standing in Egypt more than 3,000 years ago. The sun is rising over the Nile. Boats move slowly across the water, carrying grain and stone. Priests walk through temple gates, carrying incense into dark halls filled with towering columns. Merchants shout across crowded streets. Children run between market stalls. Scribes bend over papyrus scrolls while scratching symbols that would outlive entire civilizations. Everything appears stable. Everything appears eternal. Egypt feels invincible. But hidden underneath that perfect image, something dangerous is beginning to move. Because empires do not collapse in a single moment. They shift quietly. Small changes happen inside palace walls long before ordinary people notice anything at all. Powerful families begin whispering. Priests begin watching. Generals begin calculating. And somewhere hidden in those shifting shadows stands a figure that history still cannot completely explain. At first, there is nothing dramatic about the appearance. No thunder from the sky, no giant announcement, just images, small details, strange details, images carved into walls where this mysterious figure stands closer to power than expected. At first, historians barely noticed. Ancient Egypt had thousands of names, thousands of carvings, thousands of forgotten faces. One more would normally disappear into the background, except this one did not stay in the background. Slowly, the images become more unusual. The figure grows larger in official artwork. In ancient Egypt, that matters because size was not artistic preference. Size meant status. Bigger figures represented greater importance. Pharaohs towered over servants because pharaohs stood above everyone else. Gods towered above pharaohs because gods stood above kings. Scale itself was political language. And suddenly this figure is appearing almost equal beside people who should have stood above everyone else. That is strange, very strange. Then the symbols become unusual. Ceremonies once limited to kings begin appearing beside this figure. Ritual positions, once carefully protected, begin showing up again and again. Small changes continue spreading outward like cracks through glass. The average citizen probably never noticed. Why would they? Ordinary people still needed food. Farmers still worked the fields. Merchants still sold goods. Life continued. But inside palaces, symbols mattered because symbols were power. And power in Egypt was never casual. Power was performance. Every movement mattered. Every image mattered. Every title mattered. If someone stood in a place they did not traditionally belong, there was usually a reason. And reasons in royal politics could become dangerous very quickly. Imagine walking through one of those royal halls at night. Torches flicker against painted walls. Shadows move across stone faces of ancient gods staring silently from the darkness. Somewhere nearby, scribes work under dim light recording names, marriages, alliances, births, deaths. Decisions made inside these walls shaped millions of lives. One conversation could change a kingdom. One marriage could create peace. One betrayal could destroy generations of stability. Somewhere inside those halls, our mystery continued growing. Perhaps people whispered questions. Perhaps they noticed unusual privileges appearing. Perhaps some priests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Maybe powerful families started realizing that something inside Egypt was shifting in ways nobody fully understood yet. Because history teaches us something fascinating. People living through important moments almost never realize they are living through important moments. Nobody wakes up and says today, I will witness something historians will argue about for 3,000 years. Instead, they notice little things, strange details, tiny irregularities, a title appearing somewhere unexpected, a face appearing more often than before, a figure moving closer and closer toward the center of power. And sometimes those tiny details become earthquakes later. Because eventually, something impossible starts happening. The figure no longer simply stands beside power. The figure starts looking like power itself. Suddenly, images become more aggressive, more confident, more direct. Authority begins radiating from walls and statues. The symbolism becomes impossible to ignore now. And historians thousands of years later would stare at these carvings, asking the same question again and again. Were we looking at the rise of someone extraordinary? Or were we watching someone slowly rewrite reality itself while nobody noticed? Because ancient Egypt understood something humans still understand today. People believe what they repeatedly see. Show them an image enough times, and eventually the image becomes truth. Repeat a symbol long enough, and eventually nobody remembers life before it existed. Control perception, and you begin controlling memory itself. And memory is where real power lives, because armies conquer cities. But memory conquers time. The deeper you step into ancient Egypt, the stranger everything becomes. Because power inside royal courts rarely moved in straight lines. It moved quietly, like water finding cracks inside stone. Outside the palace walls, ordinary life continued exactly as always. Farmers still walked into fields before sunrise. Workers still carried limestone blocks beneath the burning heat. Boats still drifted across the Nile carrying grain, wine, wood, and stories from distant regions. To most people, the kingdom looked eternal. Egypt always looked eternal. That was one of its greatest talents. Even when storms gathered behind palace doors, the outside world still saw calm skies. But inside those halls, built from polished stone and painted with scenes of God's blessing kings, tension had started collecting like invisible smoke. Because now the mysterious figure was no longer appearing occasionally. The appearances had become impossible to ignore. More walls carried the face. More ceremonies included the presence. More official records placed the name closer and closer to the center of authority. And in ancient Egypt, that kind of movement never happened by accident. Nothing was random. Every carving required labor. Every statue required resources. Every inscription required approval. Entire teams of artists and scribes spent weeks or months creating official imagery. Nobody simply wandered into a royal temple and accidentally placed someone beside a pharaoh. Every detail passed through the layers of control, which means somebody wanted this image to exist. Somebody wanted people to see it. Somebody wanted Egypt itself to slowly accept a new reality. Imagine being one of the artists working inside those workshops. Day after day, you shape stone faces under the watch of supervisors. You carve eyes, hands, crowns, symbols. You follow rules older than your grandfather and his grandfather before him. Egyptian art was not based on creativity in the modern sense. It followed strict systems. Heads turned sideways. Eyes looked forward. Bodies followed sacred proportions. Every symbol had meaning. Every pose had purpose. So imagine the moment instructions begin changing. Make the figure larger. Move the figure closer. Give the figure symbols normally reserved for higher authority. Maybe at first nobody asked questions. Maybe questions inside royal workshops are dangerous. But humans notice patterns. Artists notice patterns especially. Eventually someone probably paused and thought something very simple. This feels different, because now ceremonies themselves begin changing. Public events become carefully arranged displays of unity and legitimacy. Crowds gather beneath enormous temple columns while incense smoke rises into the air. Priests chant beneath painted ceilings filled with stars and gods. Musicians play while banners move in desert winds. And there, standing where thousands of eyes can see, stands the figure again. Closer than expected, more visible than expected, more important than expected. Sometimes power announces itself loudly. Sometimes it introduces itself slowly until people forget things were ever different. The most effective changes rarely arrive as explosions. They arrive as repetition. Humans adapt quickly. Show them something unusual once, and they question it. Show them 100 times, and they accept it. Show them for years, and eventually, they assume it has always existed. Perhaps that was the strategy. Not force, not conflict, familiarity. Because familiarity creates comfort, and comfort creates acceptance. And acceptance eventually becomes reality. Meanwhile, whispers likely traveled through palace corridors. Nobles watched carefully because nobles survive by understanding shifts before they happen. Priests watched because religion and power were tightly connected. Military leaders watched because armies ultimately protect whoever sits closest to the throne. Everyone watches everyone else inside royal courts. Smiles become calculations. Friendships become alliances. Every conversation carries hidden meaning. Ancient royal politics looked beautiful from outside. Inside, it probably felt like walking across thin ice. One wrong step, and everything beneath you could collapse. But perhaps the strangest thing was not the growing influence itself. It was the confidence surrounding it. Because hesitation leaves traces. Fear leaves traces. Uncertainty leaves traces. Yet the imagery growing around this figure carried none of that. Instead, it carried certainty. Calm certainty. The kind of certainty that makes people stop questioning and start following. The statues looked composed. The expressions looked controlled. The posture looked deliberate. Not someone asking for authority, someone expecting it. And confidence is powerful because humans naturally assume confident people know something they do not. Maybe that was true here too. Maybe hidden beneath those palace ceilings, filled with stars, plans were already unfolding years before anyone outside realized history itself had begun changing direction. Because eventually there comes a moment in every mystery where small strange details stop feeling accidental. They start connecting. Individual puzzle pieces begin forming shapes. And once those shapes appear, people realize something unsettling. The thing they thought was standing beside power may have been moving toward the center of it all along. And by the time people notice movement like that, it is usually already too late to stop it. As months passed, Egypt itself seemed to continue breathing in its familiar rhythm. But history has a strange habit of changing direction quietly before anyone realizes the road has shifted beneath their feet. Markets remained crowded. Along the Nile, merchants shouted prices over baskets of grain and jars of oil, while children ran through narrow streets, kicking up dust beneath the afternoon sun. Fishermen still returned before sunset, carrying nets heavy with their catches. Farmers still watched river levels with the same concern their ancestors had carried for generations. To ordinary people, kingdoms felt permanent. Kings came and went, but Egypt itself always seemed older and stronger than individual rulers. The Nile still flowed. The temples still stood. The sun still climbed into the sky every morning exactly as it always had. Stability creates comfort, and comfort can hide enormous changes happening just beyond sight. But beneath the surface, beneath the painted walls and polished stone floors of royal buildings, uncertainty had begun spreading through the court like invisible cracks inside marble. Because something had started happening that frightened powerful people more than war ever could. Questions had started appearing. Questions are dangerous things inside systems built upon certainty. Armies can fight enemies. Priests can calm fear. But questions move silently. They pass between people in whispers and curious glances. And once enough questions exist, certainty begins weakening. Nobles had begun noticing unusual patterns. Certain names appeared more frequently in records. Certain individuals suddenly gained influence. Certain officials who had once stood close to power now seemed slightly farther away. Positions shifted. Access changed. Invitations moved from one person to another. Tiny details individually meant nothing. Together they meant everything. Because political earthquakes rarely begin with dramatic moments. They begin with chairs being moved around the room. Imagine attending a royal gathering during those years. Massive columns rise around you, covered with colorful carvings of gods and kings. Oil lamps flicker softly, while musicians play in distant corners of the hall. Gold jewelry catches light as nobles exchange polite smiles and carefully chosen words. On the surface, everything appears elegant and controlled. Yet beneath every conversation, another conversation exists. People are listening more carefully than speaking, watching more carefully than smiling, because everyone understands something without saying it aloud. Change has entered the room. Nobody knows exactly what shape it will take yet, but everyone can feel it standing there beside them. Ancient courts operated almost like living creatures. Information traveled quickly, even when nobody spoke directly. Servants overheard conversations while pouring wine. Scribes noticed unusual requests. Guards standing beside doors heard fragments of discussions not meant for them. Human beings noticed patterns naturally. We always have. Long before computers and newspapers existed, people still gathered information through observation. Someone notices a familiar official missing from ceremonies. Someone notices increased activity near royal workshops. Someone notices additional guards standing outside certain chambers. Eventually, small observations gather into larger stories. And stories become beliefs. Some probably believed a great transformation was coming. Others probably feared collapse. Some may have welcomed the shifting balance while others saw danger approaching. Because change always creates winners and losers. The problem is that nobody knows which side they belong to until events finally unfold. and perhaps the most unsettling part of all, was the silence surrounding everything. There were no public announcements, no grand declarations carved immediately into stone walls, no dramatic moment where someone stood before Egypt and announced that history had entered a new chapter. Instead, there was only gradual movement, slow movement, careful movement, like shadows crossing a floor as the sun changes position overhead. Day by day, the differences remained small enough to ignore. Month by month, they became harder to dismiss. Year by year, they became impossible not to see. Somewhere inside palace workshops, artists continued creating new images. Somewhere, scribes continued recording names and titles onto papyrus. Somewhere, advisors continued discussing plans behind closed doors. And somewhere, perhaps, someone already understood exactly where everything was heading. Maybe someone saw the entire picture long before everyone else. Maybe someone understood that Egypt was standing on the edge of something enormous, while everyone around them still believed they were living through ordinary days. Because history becomes obvious only after it has happened. While you're living inside it, history feels like confusion. It feels like uncertainty. It feels like strange details that don't fully make sense yet, and the people living through those moments never receive dramatic music, warning them that the world around them is changing forever. They simply wake up one morning believing it will be another ordinary day. Then years later, people look back and realize that ordinary day had quietly become the beginning of everything. And now we arrive at the strange part of every great story, the ending that never truly feels like an ending. Because history loves giving us beginnings. History loves giving us battles, kings, celebrations, and dramatic moments carved into stone. But endings are often messier. They fade slowly. They disappear into silence. And silence is exactly where the story eventually drifts. Years passed. New rulers stepped forward. New temples rose while old walls began cracking beneath wind and heat. Children grew into adults. Farmers planted fields that had been planted for generations. Boats still traveled along the Nile carrying grain, stone, and people who cared far more about tomorrow's meals than palace politics. Life continued because life always continues. Empires can shake, dynasties can shift, powerful names can vanish, but ordinary mornings keep arriving. The sun still climbs above the horizon even after history changes beneath it. Somewhere workers carved fresh inscriptions into stone, while older carvings slowly faded beneath dust. Somewhere scribes dipped brushes into ink and recorded names they believed future generations would remember forever. It's almost beautiful in a strange way. Human beings always assume they know which stories matter most. We always believe we can decide which names will survive centuries and which ones will disappear. Yet history rarely listens to those decisions. Sometimes great conquerors become forgotten shadows. Sometimes rulers who commanded enormous armies vanish into broken fragments and damaged walls. And sometimes one face, one mystery, one unanswered question refuses to disappear no matter how much time passes. Thousands of years later, people still stand in museums staring at ancient eyes painted by hands long turned to dust. They still argue about identities, timelines, disappearances, and secrets. They still search beneath sand, hoping the next discovery might finally answer questions that have survived longer than entire civilizations. That's the strange thing about ancient history. We aren't really studying dead people, not completely, because as long as someone asks questions about them, some small part of them continues existing. Curiosity becomes a kind of immortality. Maybe that's why these stories feel different from ordinary stories. We already know how modern stories end. We finish a movie. We close a book. We reach the final chapter, but ancient stories remain unfinished. There are still missing pages, still missing voices, still empty spaces where answers should be. Maybe that uncertainty is exactly what keeps pulling us back. Because human beings don't like mysteries. We say we do, but we don't. We want answers. We want neat conclusions tied together perfectly. We want to know exactly who ruled, exactly who disappeared, exactly what happened behind palace walls thousands of years ago. Yet history occasionally looks at us and simply smiles without explaining itself. Maybe some truths disappeared forever beneath collapsed buildings and forgotten tombs. Maybe certain answers turned into dust long before anyone